I wonder whether the obsession with institutions is actually very much a European thing, because you go beyond Europe and institutions don't have the same resonance they do with we Europeans. I think back to the founding of the United Nations. It was actually a British initiative, and there was always a sense in Washington.
Roosevelt made it all.
Yeah, but it was the diplomacy came from Churchill, and the whole idea, and it was, and the US always had this idea that institutions are for others, but the US is somehow above it, and I see a kind of history repeating itself to some extent. China, India, elsewhere have a different view of institutions than we Europeans, but fair point. And last but not least, the southern flank. Henrik, please, good luck with your grand strategy.
Well, thank you, Julian, and thank you, Kate, for the invitation to this very prestigious conference. I'm very grateful to be given the opportunity to come here and give you a few ideas. As a good Boy Scout, I have three things I would like to do. I would like to talk about where we are. I would like to identify some options, and then lastly to discuss where to go. So standing in the landscape with a map is basically the metaphor for my little talk here. But before I get to those three questions, a tiny preamble. So I'm an academic think tanker with the Center for Military Studies in Copenhagen, and if I'm about to ruffle some feathers, I hope that you will bear with me. I think strategic dialogue like the one we're having here today should not always be too consensual. I think that if think tanks are to add anything to the political debate and strategy making, we should not be afraid to ask hard questions and think about also politically sensitive topics. I think also that if we are to help the captain navigate the ship of the state, we should also talk about something that is not the immediate reef in front of the ship, but something further out. And that, of course, means talking about something...
I think in front of the sheep sounds better.
Oh, yeah, well, ship. And that, I think, means looking beyond Russia, especially here in Norway and in Denmark. And it means to talk about the southern flank. I think the southern flank is basically tearing Europe apart. It's undermining European unity, and it's weakening support for the very institutions that some of my august predecessors in this panel has been already talking about. I think the southern flank basically constitutes a serious strategic problem. And that gets me back to my three questions. Where are we? What are our options? And where should we go from here? Very briefly, the answers to the three questions are that, well, we are in a situation that looks like Rome in the 3rd century. The empire is crumbling from the outside. We do not care about the limes, and instead of patrolling the limes, we are bickering among ourselves, and the unity is falling apart. The answer to the options, I think we can find in American language about grand strategy. The problem is, as especially Asle talked about before, Europe is not a unitary actor, so using the American language of grand strategy has to be transposed in a certain way to a European context. And the answer to the third question, where to go, has to do with, I think, a very large investment in a shared approach to solving to finding a specific answer among the different options that I'll get back to in a second. But it will probably mean very serious investment in doing things about the southern flank. Now, where are we? 500 years ago, Ferdinand Magellan, Christopher Columbus, sailed out into the world, and as opposed to our predecessors, the Vikings, they actually colonized the world and established various kinds of empires and set out a long history of state building outside of the European continent. Now, that history for 500 years has meant that everything in world history has been about what Europe could do to the world. For the first time in 500 years, that situation is now reversing. World history is now about what the world will do to Europe. And this is a momentous change in the way that we should look at the security situation of Europe. Everything we have put together in our security apparatus, in particular with regard to the Global South, has had to do with prolonging that engagement with the Global South, building states, doing development aid, and so on for their sake. I think that the tide is turning, and we basically have to rethink all of our engagements, including the massive investments in development aid, with regard to the pendulum swinging the other way. So from now on, if the history is about what the world will do to Europe, then we are in a very different situation from the one we were before. This is first and foremost, of course, what Asle Toje talked about, namely the multipolar world where the West and Europe is no longer in a very dominant situation. In a multipolar world, we have the usual problems of security policy, namely the problems that comes from the strength of others. This, of course, is problems from Russia, it's problems from China, it's problems from great power politics, as we have seen identified in the new national defense strategy in the US context. These kinds of problems we are used to dealing with in our security apparatus. We can invest in tanks if we get around to it, and we can do security politics in the old way. I think, however, that the southern problem, the southern flank, is a problem that is conceptually difficult for our security institutions to deal with. And it's also, in the longer term, far more important, given, of course, that we are able to put together a credible deterrent with regard to Russia and to manage that situation diplomatically. The problem of the South is exactly the inverse of the problem from the East. It's not threats from the strength of others, but threats that stem from the weakness of others. And threats that stem from the weakness of others are not threats that can be shot at, generally. They are not threats that can be co-opted. We cannot buy them out, and they're very hard to cooperate with. The problem is basically that we have, as identified for the first time, I think, officially in the French Defense White Paper of 2008, an arc of crisis basically stemming from the south of Russia, over Caucasus, down over all of the Middle East and Northern Africa. We have a belt of weak and failing states that are characterized with very, very brittle institutions. As we know, in our well-functioning Scandinavian welfare societies, these institutions have been built up over centuries, and they are locked in with culture and all kinds of other things that are beyond just mere issues of law. Now, the problem about the brittle institutions in all of this arc of crisis is that they keep feeding on the problems that we see. We see the civil wars, we see unwanted migration, and we see the problem of unfulfilled promises among a population that unfortunately is growing. So we are already now in a crisis situation, but because of the demographic projections by the UN, these are not controversial numbers, because of demographic projections, we are likely to see an even worse situation in the coming decades. And for structural reasons. So even if we were able to fend off the problems as they are now, it will only get worse no matter what we do, because there are brittle institutional structures that are met with a very large increase in non-EU people. Yes.
5 minutes.
So what are we to do about this strategic problem? Well, you might imagine here, using the American language of grand strategy, you might imagine here a sorry, I just lost my notes here. Oh, there it was. There. You might imagine here a ship's telegraph. You know, one of those handles that says full speed ahead or full speed astern. It has 4 basic generic positions. Well, the 2 of these, following again the words from American Grand Strategy, are not possible to be applied to the European situation. The first of one is full speed astern. That is isolationism. But Europe is not an island, and we cannot isolate ourselves physically from Africa and from the Middle East. That is not possible for historical and physical reasons. Now, the most forward-leaning position is transformation. That would mean go all out, either with military means or with development means, and try to take responsibility for transforming these societies and these states. That does not work either. We have a very bad track record in building these states. We have a bad track record in stabilizing these states, like in Afghanistan, even if we spend a lot of manpower, blood, and money on this. And for the last 50 years, development aid has not, at a macro level, transformed these states into well-functioning societies. So that leaves us to 2 middle positions. And the one we're doing right now is engagement. I would call it uncoordinated engagement, because we do not have a very specific plan for doing soft engagement in the near abroad, in all of these buffer zones around Europe and further down in Africa. We are in a situation of uncoordinated engagement, and I think we should, at least, if that's the option that we choose, have a discussion about how to do this in a more coordinated way and in a more sustained fashion with a long-term plan. However, the last and third position on the lever is containment. It's a little bit less backwards leaning. It's not drawing up the drawbridge, but it's less forward-leaning than engagement. And I think nobody is really speaking about containment now. I think that's the big missing option in the European grand strategy debate about what to do about the Southern Agenda. What would containment mean? Well, it would fundamentally contain that we refocus more on the limes, on the borders of the European continent, that we live up to, for example, in the Schengen Agreement, that lifting the internal borders would also have to mean that we have actual physical control with the outside borders. It would probably mean that we should spend about 100 billion euros a year on a European Coast Guard and a European Border Corps. It would mean a substantial investment, about maybe 1/3 or 1/4 of the European defense budgets, in sealing off the European borders. I'm not saying we should close the borders, but we should have the ability to control the access of the borders. It's the condition for having a European political unity. Now, I think it's not all bad.
Wrap up, please,
yes,
Henrik. Thank you.
it's not all gloom. I think there's also an opportunity here. The Southern Agenda is the hottest political potato, and it's also a strategic problem for all of the European countries. There's an opportunity here for the left and right to get together and solve a problem that actually matters to all actual European populations. This would be good for all the European institutions, including for NATO, which could play a role in building up these things. But if we don't do this, I fear that it will be like Rome in the 3rd century, a slowly dissolving order. And this would, of course, also be to advantage of Putin, because that is exactly his goal. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Thank you very much indeed.